The microphone hissed the moment Jasmine Crockett leaned forward to speak. It was a quiet, insistent static that felt oddly personal, as though every silent protest in her heart was being transmitted before she even formed a word. Cameras encircled her, the glossy lenses capturing the cool set of her jaw and the resolute lift of her chin. She was on live TV, and the tension in the studio seemed to warp the space between her and the man seated across from her, a seasoned news anchor who wore the polished veneer of authority on his sleeve. She'd been invited to discuss a recent court proceeding that had everyone talking, a contested hearing, a last-minute injunction, and, rumor had it, a damning set of sealed documents. The anchor, full of his own sense of self-importance, had introduced Jasmine in a guarded tone that suggested he expected her to trip over her own words. She caught the condescending tilt of his eyebrows and the slight curl of his lip as he reminded viewers of her controversial stance. Yet Jasmine had no intention of being cornered by a man who thought his seat behind the broadcast desk conferred any real power. She could feel the pulse in her temples. Anger, yes, but also focus. 5 minutes, she told herself. She would need just 5 minutes of sustained composure to unravel the carefully packaged narrative this anchor was set to spin. She opened her mouth, voice low and controlled, but only got a syllable out before his interruption cleaved the air. "Miss Crockett, let's establish something right away," he said, emphasizing her name with an edge that tried to minimize her. She inhaled slowly, measuring the tension, refusing to let the anchor claim the floor as his exclusive domain. She responded gently, "I'm here to tell the truth." He was about to speak again, but she didn't stop. "And I promise you, I have evidence that will change the conversation completely." The anchor blinked, unsettled by the calm conviction in her voice. Yet he forced a terse laugh, his attempt to reassert control. "Evidence, Miss Crockett? That sounds dramatic. Care to elaborate?" His tone dripped with forced politeness, an undercurrent of sarcasm rippling just beneath. Jasmine's eyes flickered to the clock overhead. 5 minutes. She had to make them count. But before she could utter another word, a producer off-camera signaled for a commercial break, and the anchor seized the opportunity. "We'll be right back," he said, stifling whatever Jasmine had begun to say, turning his gaze to the viewers watching from home. The screen dissolved, replaced by a bright, over-animated commercial promoting the network's upcoming special reports. But the break was too brief to soothe the undercurrent of tension. While cameras were on pause, the anchor leaned closer, his voice low so only Jasmine could hear. "Let's keep this civil," he muttered with a patronizing grin. She studied his face, that well-practiced media smile that concealed 1,000 tiny manipulations. She felt the weight of all the watchers, producers, sound technicians, the audience at home, waiting for her next word, for the next spark that might ignite a scandal. Jasmine had spent weeks gathering documents, transcripts, sworn statements. She had questioned her own resolve many times, knowing powerful figures were prepared to undermine her. But in the hush of that studio, with the anchor's breath drifting across the table, she steeled herself. If they tried to mute her, she would speak louder. If they cut her off, she would find another way. If all else failed, she would let the truth scorch the air as soon as they returned on live TV. The broadcast resumed, and the anchor dutifully set the stage. "We're back with Jasmine Crockett, whose claims have stirred quite the conversation about our local judiciary. But some are calling this a sensationalist stunt. Miss Crockett, how do you respond?" She felt the heat rise in her chest. This was the tactic. Paint her as an attention seeker, a provocateur lacking substance. With a measured calm, she replied, "I only wish it were a stunt, for the sake of our community. If corruption didn't exist, none of us would be here having this conversation. But let me be specific. I have found documents that indicate a clear misuse of power by certain authorities within the court system." She allowed herself to pause. She wanted that sentence to resonate, to reverberate in the viewers' minds. There was a thick silence as the anchor's eyes narrowed. He was about to cut in again, but she continued, "I'm talking about sealed affidavits, locked away to protect reputations at the expense of justice. I'm talking about transcripts that were doctored to remove any hint of bias from the bench." Her voice trembled only slightly with anger, but it was enough to send a ripple of electricity through the broadcast. The anchor tightened his lips. "Ms. Crockett, that's a serious allegation. If you have such proof, Perhaps you should share it directly with the authorities. Our viewers want to know if you're just stirring the pot." He was trying to corner her yet again, and she recognized the ploy. She had been a lawyer long enough to spot rhetorical traps. She swallowed, keeping her composure. "I intend to share everything I have, including the judge's personal email correspondences that show a clear conflict of interest. But let's not pretend the authorities don't already know. They do, and they've been sitting on it. This has gone beyond internal oversight. It's a matter of public trust." The anchor let out a little scoff. She saw his jaw tense, as though her words had struck a nerve. His next line was clipped and merciless. "And you genuinely think you can upend an entire institution on your own?" That was the moment her phone began to vibrate in her jacket pocket. She could feel the dull tremors against her side, but she didn't break eye contact with the anchor. The sense of living in two worlds, the immediate confrontation in the studio, and the larger war raging outside, flickered in the corners of her vision. Jasmine's mind flashed back to the turning point that had brought her here. It was a single day, a single hearing, but it changed everything she believed about the law and its guardians. She recalled the moment she stepped into a small, overcrowded courtroom to observe a routine proceeding, only to discover the presiding judge, a powerful figure known for his swift judgments, wearing an expression that sent a chill down her spine. She had noticed the hush that fell over the room when he entered, the clerk's eyes drifting to the floor in a gesture of defeated compliance, the defendants looking resigned and beaten before the hearing even started. And in that hush, she sensed something profoundly wrong, the quiet acceptance of injustice disguised as procedure. Over the next days and weeks, she heard whispers from court employees, read between the lines of official transcripts. She felt the weight of a system that demanded obedience without question, and she saw how that demand was enforced, not openly, but through subtle intimidation. Court clerks were overworked and underpaid, frightened that stepping out of line would mean losing their jobs. Defendants, especially those lacking resources, found themselves railroaded by a process they didn't fully understand. Attorneys who dared challenge certain rulings faced unexplained delays in their other cases. Little by little, Jasmine pieced together a puzzle of corruption so sprawling it felt insurmountable. She discovered one piece, a single email from the judge to a private interest group, promising a favorable ruling in exchange for campaign contributions, and from that moment on, she knew she could never unsee it. The righteous anger that had fueled her from that day forward shone in her eyes now. The anchor attempted to break her concentration. "Let's come back to the specifics of your allegations," he pressed. "Viewers at home will wonder if you're simply out to settle a personal score. Are you? Did you have a run-in with this judge that colored your perspective?" She felt an almost physical punch of frustration, but she reined it in. "Yes, I had a run-in. If you mean that I witnessed blatant misconduct in a place I once believed was the sanctuary of justice. I tried to handle it within the system, but every door was slammed shut. So, here I am, forced to speak publicly because no one else would listen." In the control room, producers gestured wildly. The conversation was running hot, and the anchor had to keep it from boiling over into uncontrollable territory. Yet Jasmine could see a flicker of interest in his eyes. The anchor might have wanted to dismiss her, but controversy was good for ratings. He let her continue, but he was poised to pounce on any slip or moment of uncertainty. She took a measured breath. "I know there are people watching right now who feel powerless when they stand in front of a judge. Some have lost their homes, their livelihoods, because the scales weren't balanced. This is for them, too. The documents I have, they show a direct link between certain rulings and campaign donors. They show that if you had enough money, you could buy the outcome of a trial. And I'm not talking about small claims or petty disputes. I'm talking about life-altering sentences that have sent innocent people to prison. I'm talking about families who've lost everything because of twisted legal logic designed to favor the highest bidder." The anchor's composure slipped for just a fraction of a second, but he recovered. "Those are grave claims, Ms. Crockett. Can you prove them, or are we supposed to take your word for it?" The question hung in the charged air. Jasmine stared at him, letting the tension build once more. She placed a slim file on the table between them, the label facing the camera. The anchor's eyes flicked to it with curiosity, but he also looked uneasy. She saw him swallow, just a hint of dread. She said, "What you see here is only a fraction of what I've compiled. Names, dates, sums of money, email correspondences, text message logs. I can show that certain judges and their allies made sure to reward their financial backers with favorable rulings. And that's just the beginning. I've also found evidence of suppressed evidence, things that could have exonerated defendants but were deemed inadmissible under questionable circumstances. A hush fell over the studio. The phone in her pocket kept buzzing, but she ignored it. That must be her contact inside the courthouse. She suspected they had more to tell her, more she could use. But for now, she focused on the anchor, who had gone momentarily silent. Then he cleared his throat, and a disdainful smirk tugged at his lips. You realize the weight of what you're saying. You're accusing an entire judicial district of corruption. This kind of narrative could destroy public faith in the justice system. She refused to let him mischaracterize her stance. No, the corruption itself destroys public faith. Addressing it is how we restore faith. Pretending it isn't there just keeps people broken and afraid. He began to speak again, but producers cut him short this time. Ironic, considering how he had just tried to silence her. A short, urgent break in the broadcast was announced. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. She had used this platform to show glimpses of the truth. Now the entire region was buzzing, no doubt. When the cameras went off, the anchor shot up from his chair and walked a few feet away, speaking in hushed tones with another staff member. Jasmine allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, recentering. Only 5 minutes. 5 minutes of clarity and a willingness to be unafraid, and she had turned the conversation on its head. But her work was far from done. When the cameras blinked on again, the anchor's usual demeanor had shifted. He was tense, less smug. He started speaking, his words clipped. Before we continue, there's a breaking update from the courthouse. It appears a new motion has been filed related to the judge in question. Jasmine felt her blood run cold. This was unexpected. She wondered if her contact had just filed something to push the matter into the public sphere. Or perhaps the judge's allies were making a countermove. Ms. Crockett, the anchor went on. There's talk of an official investigation into your claims. Are you aware of any of this? She hadn't known it was happening so quickly, but she welcomed it. I'm thrilled if they finally investigate. That means this can't be brushed aside as rumor. The anchor gave her a level look, as though weighing how far he could push her without letting her unravel his carefully managed broadcast. But the urgency of the courthouse update made him change tactics. He gestured at her file. So you say you have the evidence that's triggering an investigation? She reached out, almost protectively, to touch the file's worn edges. I do, she stated softly, and I'm prepared to submit it to the authorities. But I also have backup copies. Once something is out there, it can't be silenced by a single man in a robe or by a network of political donors. A faint beep from the control room signaled a shift in the program's format. Viewer calls, presumably. The anchor rolled with it, introducing a voice call from a concerned citizen. The screen displayed nothing but a pulsing audio waveform as a woman's voice shook through the line. She identified herself as Terry. In a trembling tone, Terry explained she had been a defendant in a civil case presided over by the same judge Jasmine had named. Terry's voice cracked when she recalled how she lost her home after a ruling that favored a wealthy developer. She had always suspected the outcome was predetermined, but she had never found proof. She couldn't afford the legal fees to challenge the ruling. Jasmine listened, her heart pounding with empathy. Terry's words confirmed every suspicion, every reason Jasmine had begun her quest. The anchor let Terry speak for a moment, then cut in abruptly to wrap up the call. The dryness in his voice revealed his discomfort with a real-life example that validated Jasmine's claims. Jasmine cleared her throat. What happened to Terry is the perfect illustration of why I'm doing this. People with fewer resources shouldn't stand helpless before a bench that's been bought and paid for. There's no real justice in that. And it's not just civil matters. This extends to criminal cases, where people's freedom is on the line. Her voice grew thick with emotion. The anchor's jaw flexed. He was watching her with a wary eye, uncertain if letting her continue would open a floodgate he couldn't control. The show's time was nearing its end, and the producers were signaling to wrap up. The anchor, with forced courtesy, asked if Jasmine had any final comments. She seized the moment. I want people to know the law should serve them, not the other way around. And if the law has become twisted, if those entrusted with upholding justice have turned it into a profit scheme, then we must call it out. Today is just the beginning. I have the documents, but I'm not alone in this, and I won't be silenced. The broadcast ended with an uncomfortably abrupt cut, the anchor looking both tense and relieved that it was over. The second the camera's red light switched off, producers and staffers rushed the set. Jasmine clutched the file to her chest. It was surreal, standing under the bright studio lights as staffers started powering down cameras, and the anchor brushed past her with a terse nod. But her phone was still vibrating, message after message pouring in. She walked off stage, ignoring the anxious glances from the crew, and found a quiet corner where she answered the call from her inside source at the courthouse. The voice on the other end was tight with urgency. "They're moving fast," the caller whispered. "I overheard them drafting a motion to hold you in contempt, trying to bar you from releasing the documents publicly. They might even go for an injunction." Jasmine's heart pounded. She realized the next few hours would be critical. If they succeeded in legally muzzling her, everything she had would be locked down by court order. She pressed her lips together, determination flaring. "They can try," she said, voice fierce. "But I'm getting this out no matter what. Email me everything you have. And stay safe." The line clicked. She stood in the shadow of tall towers of studio equipment, her mind racing. Stepping outside the station, she was met by a small group of journalists, real journalists, the kind who still believed in pursuing the truth at all costs. They formed a loose semicircle around her, clamoring with questions. One asked, "Is it true you have evidence linking the judge's rulings to bribery?" Another, "Are you prepared for retaliation?" Another, "Why speak out now?" Jasmine took a deep breath. She kept her answers concise, repeating the gist of what she'd said on air. But she felt a sense of relief that at least these reporters seemed genuinely interested in uncovering the facts, not just performing a sensational interview for ratings. As she walked away, the phone in her pocket buzzed with new calls and messages, supporters, skeptics, distant relatives, old colleagues. The public churn had begun. She thought back to the anchor's question about whether she really thought she could single-handedly take down a corrupt institution. No, of course she didn't. But someone had to be the first wave against the fortress. She smiled grimly, tugging her coat closed against a chill breeze, and set off for the courthouse. In the hours that followed, Jasmine moved through a surreal whirlwind of bureaucracy and suspicion. She stepped into the marble-floored halls of the courthouse, her footsteps echoing. She could feel eyes on her, bailiffs, clerks, attorneys. Some offered nods of respect or fleeting smiles of encouragement. Others narrowed their gaze, threatened by her presence. She had filed a motion that morning, requesting an emergency hearing to present her evidence. It was a risky play, a legal strategy that put her at the mercy of the very institution she was challenging. But if she didn't do it, her revelations would be easily dismissed as rumor or attention-grabbing theatrics. She located the clerk's office, where a weary-eyed woman behind the glass partition recognized her name instantly. The clerk's voice was subdued. "I've got your paperwork. We're scheduling the hearing." Jasmine detected an undercurrent of fear. "Thank you," Jasmine said, forcing a polite smile. "Is it set for today?" The clerk nodded. "Yes, late afternoon session. They want to keep it low profile." Of course, Jasmine thought. They'd want to bury her motion at the tail end of the day when the press is fewer and the watchers more tired. She nodded her thanks. The clerk's eyes darted around, as if to check who might be observing. Jasmine found a moment of calm in the hallway outside the clerk's office. She sank onto a bench, letting her gaze settle on the polished floor. She took out her file, flipping through pages of transcripts. Each line reminded her of the heartbreak people had endured, the stolen dignity. She read about a father separated from his children because of an unjust custody ruling that favored a wealthier spouse who'd paid off the right people. She saw the sentencing disparity for two defendants with nearly identical charges, except one had connections and the other did not. The differences in outcomes were glaring. She felt a well of righteous anger churn in her stomach, but also a sense of purpose that steadied her nerves. The day wore on, the courthouse swallowing time in its methodical churn. When Jasmine finally stepped into the assigned courtroom for her emergency hearing, she was met by an unassuming judge from another district, someone she'd never stood before. This judge, wearing rimless glasses that perched precariously on a narrow nose, gave Jasmine a long, guarded look. Then the judge motioned for her to approach the bench. The tension in the air crackled, making every slow footstep resonate like a drum. The seats behind her were mostly empty, save for a few curious onlookers and a smattering of press who'd managed to slip in for the tail end of the business day. No one from the opposing side had arrived yet, which was odd. Usually, they'd be present, armed with documents, ready to push back. But at that moment, Jasmine felt alone at the council's table. She waited in the hush, eyes darting to the large clock overhead, noticing the seconds slip by. The judge rapped a gavel lightly. "Miss Crockett, is there a representative from the court or the named defendants scheduled to attend?" Jasmine glanced at the clerk near the judge's stand. The clerk shrugged. They were notified. The clerk offered, voice barely audible. The judge sighed, turning to Jasmine. "Very well, we'll proceed. You filed a motion to unseal certain documents and request an evidentiary hearing, correct?" Jasmine stood, her posture rigid but her voice calm. "Yes, Your Honor." She started to outline the corruption she had uncovered, referencing pages and exhibits. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, and though the judge kept a neutral expression, Jasmine noticed the tension in the lines around the judge's mouth. By the time she finished her initial presentation, the corners of the judge's lips had tightened into a thin line of concern. The judge cleared their throat. "I trust you realize the gravity of what you're alleging, Miss Crockett. If your claims are substantiated, the implications are profound. But if they're not..." The door slammed open at that moment, cutting the judge short. Several men in suits marched in, led by a tall figure with a hard-set jaw, one of the chief counsel representing the local judiciary. Jasmine recognized him, a longtime political operative, known for protecting judges from scrutiny with a dogged determination. He strode to the defense table, ignoring Jasmine entirely. The judge's eyebrows rose. "I trust you've arrived to provide a rebuttal?" The tall man's tone was crisp. "Yes, Your Honor. We object to the premise of Ms. Crockett's motion. She's making unsubstantiated claims that will cause irreparable harm to the reputation of the court." He stressed the word reputation, as if that alone should suffice to deny Jasmine's motion. Jasmine stepped forward. "I have evidence," she said firmly, "and I am requesting the court's assistance in bringing it to light." The tall man shot her a withering glare. "Your so-called evidence is incomplete at best, and likely obtained illegally at worst. We move for immediate dismissal. Moreover, we intend to file for contempt if Ms. Crockett releases any privileged information without a proper subpoena." Jasmine felt a spark of fury, but the judge held up a hand to maintain order. For the next hour, a tense, methodical dance unfolded. Jasmine presented the logic behind her request, citing relevant legal precedents. The tall man countered with accusations that she was violating confidentiality rules, that she had no standing to release internal communications. The judge listened with a furrowed brow, occasionally interjecting to clarify a point of law. As the hearing dragged on, it became clear that the opposing counsel's main tactic was to stall and misdirect. They offered no explanations for the suspicious patterns Jasmine highlighted. Instead, they questioned her motives, her professional conduct, her alleged personal vendettas. The atmosphere grew thick with restrained hostility. Every so often, Jasmine would notice the silent watchers in the back row, the reporters, or perhaps curious members of the public. She wondered how many people were silently rooting for her to prevail, how many had themselves felt the sting of a broken system. Finally, the judge called for a brief recess. Jasmine sank into her chair, exhaustion prickling at the corners of her eyes. She realized she'd been running on adrenaline for hours. Her phone buzzed yet again with messages, but she couldn't focus on them. She had to stay present. When the judge returned, the soft clack of the gavel restored order. "I'm inclined to grant a partial unsealing of the documents Ms. Crockett references," the judge announced. A collective rustle spread across the courtroom. Jasmine's heart pounded with cautious optimism. Then the judge continued. "However, certain materials may need to be reviewed in camera to determine their admissibility. This is a serious matter. If the documents do demonstrate corruption, that has to come out. If they do not, Ms. Crockett's credibility will be severely compromised. We'll reconvene for a formal evidentiary hearing tomorrow at 9. Court is adjourned." That was it. A step forward, but also a warning. The tall man glared at Jasmine, then swept out of the room, cell phone already at his ear. She watched him go, thinking, the lines are drawn. She could almost hear the wheels of the machine screeching into motion behind closed doors. Her body trembled with a mixture of relief and anticipation. A partial unsealing might be enough to keep her from being gagged. It might also incite the institution to come after her with everything they had. Still, she had no regrets. She left the courthouse, the evening sky tinged with a deep orange glow that made the world look aflame. Her next move would be crucial. She had to ensure the public had access to the truth before it was buried again. Even if she prevailed in court, they could drag the process out for months, maybe years. Meanwhile, people would continue suffering under unjust rulings. She hurried to her car, placed the file securely in the trunk, and texted her contacts to set up a clandestine meeting. They met after dark in the back room of a local bookstore. The proprietor was an old friend, an ardent believer in free speech. Two reporters from independent newspapers were waiting. Jasmine could see the excitement and nervousness in their eyes. She laid out copies of her evidence on a worn wooden table. She asked them to confirm the authenticity of each email, each financial transaction, each suspicious ruling. She wanted multiple layers of verification. If this was going public, it needed to be airtight. The older of the two reporters spoke in a hushed voice. "This is bigger than I thought. It spans multiple counties, multiple judges, possibly even higher up." Jasmine felt her jaw tighten. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it more real. The second reporter, a younger woman with sharp instincts, asked, "What about blowback? They'll come after us if we publish this." Jasmine's eyes flicked to the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. "They might," she acknowledged. "But if we move quickly and release it all at once, they won't have time to squash every outlet. If they try, that becomes another story, an obvious cover-up." The older reporter nodded thoughtfully. "A mass release. We coordinate with other outlets, get everything out there simultaneously. Then they can't single out one source." For the next few hours, they worked quietly, scanning, cross-referencing, building a digital trove of evidence. Jasmine felt an odd calm settle over her, even though she knew she was courting disaster by not waiting for the official hearing. Part of her reasoned that if the hearing was compromised or delayed indefinitely, the truth would stay locked away. She refused to let that happen. By the time she emerged from the bookstore, the city lights shimmered against the midnight sky. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through a barrage of messages, some from concerned friends, some from strangers expressing support or condemnation. Her inside source had left a single cryptic text: "They're pulling out all the stops. You need to watch your back." She slipped her phone away, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. The next morning's hearing might bring an avalanche of legal threats, but she had already set her plan in motion. She arrived at the courthouse early, passing through security with the file in hand. This time, the corridors were humming with quiet tension. Word had spread about the partial unsealing. People who worked in the building seemed edgy, as though they sensed a storm brewing. Jasmine made her way to the assigned courtroom and took her seat at the plaintiff's table, arranging her documents neatly. She noticed the opposing counsel arrive, flanked by two more attorneys, all wearing stern expressions. The judge swept in a moment later, robes billowing. Once again, the gallery was sparsely populated, though she spotted a few familiar reporters among the spectators. The hearing commenced with formality, the judge reciting the purpose and cautioning that any outbursts would lead to removal from the courtroom. Then the judge turned to Jasmine. "Miss Crockett, please present the documents you wish to unseal and summarize the relevance." Jasmine stood, stepped forward, and distributed copies to the judge, the clerk, and opposing counsel. Her voice steady, she explained how each exhibit indicated a pattern of judicial rulings correlated with private campaign contributions and personal favors. She spoke of case after case, weaving the narrative that had cost her sleepless nights. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The tall opposing counsel cleared his throat indignantly. "Your Honor, we reiterate our objection. The chain of custody for these documents is questionable. Ms. Crockett is effectively asking this court to believe that these communications are legitimate." The judge flipped through the papers, adjusting their glasses. "I see the documents are quite extensive. Ms. Crockett, have you had them verified by any third parties?" Jasmine nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Multiple independent reporters have verified the metadata, and I can produce digital backups." The judge cast a sharp glance at opposing counsel, who twitched, as though annoyed by the thoroughness of Jasmine's approach. "We'll admit these for preliminary review," the judge declared. Then, a moment of silence. The judge studied the pages, lips tightening. These suggest that at least one judge was exchanging messages with external parties about ongoing cases. Some messages indeed indicate possible favoritism. The tall man stood again, voice taut with frustration. "We argue these are hearsay, incomplete, and illegally obtained. We demand Ms. Crockett reveal her sources." Jasmine bristled. She'd promised to protect her inside source. She also knew the law recognized certain privileges for whistleblowers. She looked the judge in the eye. "Your Honor, revealing my sources would endanger them. I've submitted the documents for the court's review. That should suffice at this stage." The tension ratcheted up further when the tall man insisted the hearing be postponed to allow for a thorough forensic analysis. Jasmine saw through the tactic, stalling. The judge glanced at the clock, expression drawn. "I'll grant a brief delay, but not an indefinite one. This matter is too serious." The tall man nodded, feigning reluctant agreement, but Jasmine could almost sense his satisfaction. Delay, in their eyes, would buy enough time to orchestrate a counter-narrative. The judge banged the gavel lightly, signaling a recess. And just like that, the possibility of a swift revelation slipped away. Yet Jasmine felt a small measure of pride. The evidence was on the record, the unsealing partially granted. By the time the courtroom cleared, she noticed a swirl of movement near the entrance, reporters huddling, discussing the next steps. Some of them glanced at her with respect, others with apprehension. She made her exit, weaving through the hallway. She had barely reached the front steps when her phone buzzed. It was the younger reporter from last night. "We released the materials to multiple outlets," the reporter breathed. "They're going public as we speak. There's no turning back now." Jasmine's pulse raced. She cast a glance around, half expecting men in suits to appear out of nowhere. She realized that by tomorrow morning, the entire city might know the details of the scandal. And from there, it would spread. She ended the call, feeling equal parts relief and dread. By late afternoon, everything changed. The first online articles appeared, detailing the contents of the unsealed emails and the suspicious correlations between campaign donations and judicial rulings. Social media exploded with outrage, confusion, and debates. Television news cycles began picking up the story, replaying snippets of Jasmine's interview from the day before. Jasmine Crockett, they announced, claims to have uncovered systemic corruption. Court officials deny wrongdoing. Hashtags referencing the scandal started trending, capturing the public's anger and disbelief. Some critics labeled Jasmine a grandstander, but many seemed to rally to her side, sharing personal anecdotes of feeling shortchanged or mistreated by the justice system. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the machinery of damage control kicked into high gear. The judge at the center of the controversy released a statement calling Jasmine's allegations baseless, slanderous, and irresponsible. The courthouse's PR department insisted they had always acted with integrity. Prominent politicians weighed in, some calling for calm, others demanding an immediate independent investigation. Jasmine found herself in the eye of the storm, a wave of calls and requests for interviews crashing into her from all directions. She made a quick appearance on another network, though she was wary after her last experience. This time, the host was more sympathetic, perhaps smelling the wind of public opinion shifting. Jasmine recounted the broad strokes of her findings, emphasizing that she didn't want to destroy the judiciary. She wanted to reform it. Her sincerity shone through the camera lens, and for the first time, she felt a wave of public support. The host asked one final question. "What if you fail, Ms. Crockett? What if the system's too big, too entrenched?" She paused. Images of every face that had suffered flashed through her mind. Terry, the father who lost custody, the families of those unjustly incarcerated. Then she spoke firmly. Failure isn't an option. Because for every day we do nothing, more lives get torn apart. The system exists to protect people, not to profit off them. If it's broken, we fix it. Simple as that. She left the studio feeling a surge of resolve. Yet she knew that with every public statement she made, the target on her back grew bigger. It didn't take long for the threats to escalate. Later that evening, as she was returning to her apartment, she noticed a dark sedan idling on her street. When she parked, the sedan's headlights flicked on, and it slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. The next morning, Anonymous messages found their way into her inbox, some frighteningly specific in their intimidation. She tried to file a police report, but the local precinct seemed uninterested in anything that smacked of political friction. Still, she refused to be cowed. She reached out to a few trusted allies, a local politician she believed to be honest, some advocacy groups that fought for judicial transparency, and formed a loose coalition of supporters who would keep an eye on her and her investigations. Publicly, the scandal deepened. More documents were leaked, revealing not just one judge, but several working in tandem, making decisions that favored wealthy donors, private corporations, and political elites. The bribes, though rarely direct, formed a trail of donations that suspiciously coincided with favorable rulings. The story grew into a monstrous beast the media couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel and their allies kept pushing for legal action against Jasmine, claiming she had violated confidentiality and tarnished the reputation of respected judges. Amid this chaos, Jasmine found herself summoned once more to court. This time, the hearing was about whether to grant an injunction preventing her from publicly sharing any more documents. If granted, it would effectively gag her. The hearing was presided over by yet another judge, an older woman whose lined face suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. The moment Jasmine stepped into the courtroom, she felt an unnerving hush. The tall man was there again, flanked by reinforcements, at least 3 more attorneys representing different judges implicated in the scandal. They wanted to unite against the common threat, her. She steadied her breathing, recalling her training. She'd faced intimidation before, but rarely on this scale. The older judge called the session to order. The tall man launched into his argument, painting Jasmine as a vigilante who was irresponsibly releasing private communications and half-truths, causing undue chaos in the community. He demanded an immediate injunction, likening her documents to stolen property. Jasmine stood her ground. She detailed how whistleblower protections and the public interest in exposing corruption outweighed the confidentiality claims. She cited precedents where the court recognized that public good can trump privacy, especially when evidence of systematic wrongdoing is at stake. The older judge asked pointed questions, clearly testing the merits of both sides. Eventually, the judge turned a keen gaze on Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett, if I do not grant the injunction, are you prepared for the consequences of continuing to release these documents? The burden of proof rests heavily on you to show they are genuine and that your actions serve the greater good." Jasmine met the judge's gaze. "I am prepared, Your Honor, and I stand by the authenticity of the evidence. If we shield corruption behind legal technicalities, we fail the citizens we're meant to serve." A dense pause settled over the courtroom. Then, in a measured tone, the older judge announced, "The motion for injunction is denied." A collective gasp echoed in the room. The tall man looked furious, his fists clenching at his sides. But the judge wasn't done. "However," she continued, "Ms. Crockett, you are instructed not to release any information that pertains to ongoing criminal cases without first redacting sensitive personal data. We must protect innocents who might get caught in the crossfire." Jasmine nodded, relief mingling with respect for the judge's measured approach. The court adjourned, and in the hallway, the tall man glowered at her. "This isn't over," he hissed before storming off. Outside, reporters bombarded her with questions. "What do you plan to do now? Are you afraid of retaliation? Will you keep releasing documents?" She took a deep breath, scanning the sea of microphones and determined faces. "I'll keep fighting," she said simply. That night, a wave of relief poured over her. With the injunction denied, her freedom to expose the documents remained intact. But she knew the war was only beginning. Over the next week, headlines blared with new revelations. Whistleblowers came forward, court staffers, attorneys who had long suspected something was rotten, even a few judges who claimed they'd been pressured by political forces. The scandal rippled upward, threatening to topple careers and send shockwaves through the entire state. The public seemed divided. Some hailed Jasmine as a hero, championing her bravery. Others derided her as a troublemaker who endangered the stability of the judicial system. Protests formed outside the courthouse, demanding resignations. A hush of fear settled on judges across the region. For decades, they had enjoyed near immunity, rarely questioned, their rulings final. Now the tide of public scrutiny had turned against them. Investigative committees formed at the state level. Talks of impeachment for certain judges began swirling. Jasmine found herself repeatedly summoned to give testimony, to present evidence under oath. Each time she emerged from those hearings, she was greeted by a swarm of cameras and anxious onlookers, hungry for each new scrap of information. With every passing day, her personal risk grew. Strange cars loitered near her office. Anonymous letters threatened lawsuits and worse. Yet amid this storm, she discovered unexpected allies. A quiet solidarity formed among those who had also tasted the bitterness of the system's failings. She received heartfelt messages from individuals who had lost cases under suspicious circumstances, from families who thanked her for giving them hope. Still, she felt the emotional toll. Each new day was a battle, requiring steely nerves and a commitment to the cause that sometimes left her exhausted to the bones. Through it all, the memory of her live TV appearance stayed with her. The way the anchor had cut her off, the disbelief in his eyes, the sheer nerve it took to continue speaking in defiance. That moment of interruption, that attempt to muzzle her, had become a catalyst for the events that followed. The truth, once glimpsed, had grown too large to contain. One night, after a particularly grueling day of depositions, Jasmine found herself alone in her apartment, the city lights glowing faintly through the windows. She opened her laptop, scrolling through endless news articles. Everywhere, her name seemed to appear, tethered to words like scandal, expose, and controversy. She felt a stab of regret for the peace she'd lost, but also a deep conviction that she was doing the right thing. If the system was broken, it had to be revealed before it could be fixed. And if she bore the brunt of that revelation, so be it. She refused to succumb to fear. The next morning, a surprising development awaited her. A high-ranking official in the state's Judicial Oversight Commission reached out, requesting a private meeting. She was wary but intrigued. They met in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. The official, a soft-spoken yet authoritative figure, expressed concern about what had been uncovered. "I believe you," they said quietly, "and I want to help. But you have to understand, this corruption runs deep. It's going to get messy." Jasmine nodded, her gaze steady. "I know. I'm prepared." The official pressed a sealed envelope into her hand. "These are documents we've compiled internally, cases that raised red flags over the years. We never had the impetus to dig deeper until now. Perhaps this will help you strengthen your argument." She studied the official's solemn face. "Thank you," she murmured, recognizing the risk they were taking. This could be invaluable. Armed with this new evidence, Jasmine returned to the courts, bolstering her case. She filed additional motions, urging the recusal of certain judges implicated in the scandal. Each day brought a new wave of revelations, outraging the public further. Political figures who once dismissed her began calling for her to testify at state-level hearings. She stepped up to the microphone in ornate legislative chambers, recounting her discoveries in a voice that trembled only with determination. The legislative panel grilled her, trying to poke holes in her account. But the data was overwhelming, the pattern too stark to dismiss. Some lawmakers, sensing the shift in public sentiment, expressed shock and condemnation, promising reforms. Others tried to minimize the implications, claiming these were isolated incidents. Jasmine's testimony made national news. Suddenly, cameras from the biggest networks in the country were pointed at her. And ironically, the same anchor who had tried to silence her before reached out, requesting a follow-up interview. She politely declined. She had learned the difference between those seeking truth and those chasing spectacle. Yet for all the progress, the fight wasn't over. The corrupt faction within the judiciary had not surrendered. They hired spin doctors, mounted legal challenges, and even orchestrated smear campaigns. Leaked stories questioned Jasmine's personal life, painting her as a radical with hidden motives. Fake social media accounts circulated rumors that she was being funded by a rival political group. The noise was deafening, but beneath it, the core facts remained. The documents were real, the evidence irrefutable. The momentum of truth swelled like a river after a storm, too powerful to be contained by half-truths and deflections. Large-scale protests now demanded that indicted judges step down. Under immense pressure, one of the high-profile judges implicated in the scandal gave a tearful press conference announcing his resignation. He claimed to have been misled by advisors, but the public reaction was unsympathetic. Another judge tried to brazen it out, insisting she'd never compromised her integrity, but fresh emails surfaced that directly contradicted her claims. Calls for impeachment or forced retirement grew louder. Public trust was at an all-time low, forcing government officials to act. Investigations launched in multiple jurisdictions, shining a harsh light on how deeply the corruption had spread. As the wave of accountability grew, Jasmine found a sense of vindication, but also recognized that toppling a corrupt system was only the first step. True reform would require rebuilding from the ground up, implementing checks and balances that prevented future abuses. In a meeting with newly appointed oversight officials, she proposed specific reforms: an independent body to review complaints, transparent financial disclosures for judges, stricter recusal standards when campaign donors appear in court. The officials listened with what seemed like genuine interest. Whether or not they'd implement these reforms remained to be seen, but at least the conversation was happening. A year later, in a packed courthouse auditorium, an unprecedented event took place. A coalition of newly appointed judges, representatives from the Oversight Commission, and community leaders gathered to publicly commit to a transparency initiative. Cameras rolled, capturing the moment. Jasmine Crockett was invited to speak at the podium. Her heart pounded as she looked at the audience. She saw the faces of people she'd helped, families who'd found justice after having it denied for so long. She spoke softly but firmly, reminding everyone that power left unchecked will always drift toward abuse, that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, and that it was everyday citizens who demanded this reckoning. The audience stood in applause, though Jasmine felt a pang thinking of how much suffering had to occur before these reforms were considered. In the days that followed, some questioned if the momentum would last. Others worried the newly formed committees would be co-opted by political interests, losing their edge. Jasmine understood those doubts all too well. She reminded people that this was a beginning, not a finale. The real challenge would be to maintain vigilance. Meanwhile, the anchor who had once dismissed her so smugly tried to book her again for a feature, presumably to ride the wave of her now glowing reputation. She never returned his calls. Instead, she made selective media appearances with journalists who had demonstrated genuine integrity. Public perception of her had shifted dramatically, from a perceived troublemaker on the fringe to an icon of resistance against corruption. Still, she resisted any notion of hero worship. She knew her role had been to expose, to fight, to push for change, but the success depended on a collective effort. Eventually, the day came when she could walk down the courthouse halls without feeling tension coil in her gut. Most of the old faces that once embodied corruption were gone, either retired or facing legal consequences of their own. In their place were new appointees, overshadowed by the demands of the public to restore faith in the judiciary. She knew the system wasn't perfect. It likely never would be. But the first step, openly acknowledging the rot, had been taken. She stood on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon sun, remembering the swirl of camera flashes from that day she'd been interrupted on live TV. She recalled the anchor's sneer, his attempt to corner her, and how 5 minutes later she had exposed enough truth to ignite an entire movement. Looking around now, she saw how far those revelations had carried her, how they had rippled through every level of power in the city and beyond. The memory of that broadcast was emblazoned in her mind, not as a moment of shame or doubt, but as the instant she decided no one would silence her ever again. She left the courthouse with her chin held high, footsteps echoing with confidence. And somewhere, in living rooms and across the internet, people who'd once felt voiceless watched her story unfold and realized that when corruption stands unchallenged, sometimes all it takes is one determined voice to spark a revolution of accountability. She was that voice, and nothing, not a hostile anchor, not a corrupt coalition, not the specter of intimidation, could take that away.